The wind screamed through the narrow pass as Elara stood on the edge of the town's saloon porch, her hair whipped loose and eyes blazing like flint. Men lined the street, spitting in the snow, murmuring about the woman who had turned down every offer for marriage and work, who rode horses bareback and swore she'd never wear a bonnet. Too wild, they called her. She had chased off a banker's son with a rifle last winter, and last week she'd been seen racing her mare into the frozen river just to prove she could cross it. Now, standing in front of the saloon, she was facing 3 men, her uncle among them, who had decided enough was enough. "You'll marry who I say," her uncle snarled, his hand gripping her arm so tight she could feel her pulse in his fingers. Snowflakes stuck to her lashes as she jerked away, but his grip only tightened. The gathered crowd seemed to enjoy the spectacle, waiting for her to break. She wouldn't. She never did. But the moment her uncle raised his hand to strike her, a shadow moved from the far end of the street. A tall man with raven-black hair streaked with snow, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, his dark eyes locked on her like he'd been tracking her for miles. Without breaking stride, he walked straight up, his boots crunching in the snow, and in a low voice that cut through the mutters, he said, "Let her go." Her uncle laughed, recognizing the Comanche brand stitched into the man's coat. "This is Comanche business now?" he mocked. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he leaned down, sweeping Elara into his arms before anyone could react, her gasp muffled by the heavy wool at his shoulder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "You can't just take her," someone shouted, but the rancher was already walking away, snow swirling around them, his boots leaving deep prints that filled quickly in the wind. Elara kicked once, but his grip was steady, not rough, not hurting her, just certain. Her heart slammed in her chest, confusion tangling with the sudden heat of his body against the cold. She had spent years making sure no man claimed her. Now she didn't know if she was being kidnapped or saved. The snow deepened as the Comanche rancher carried Elara past the last flicker of lamplight from town, his long strides unbroken by the icy wind that whipped across the plains. Her breath came in sharp bursts against his chest, the scent of leather and pine wrapping around her senses. "Put me down," she demanded, her voice muffled but steady, though her fingers were numb inside his coat. He didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he shifted her weight slightly, his grip tightening as if to say there was no chance of that happening. The only sound was the crunch of his boots and the low whistle of the wind through the bare cottonwoods. Finally, he stopped beside a tall, black mare tied to a fence post half buried in snow. Without asking, he swung her onto the saddle, his hands sure but careful, like she was something fragile he didn't trust the world to hold. She grabbed the horn, glaring down at him. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded. His dark eyes lifted, meeting hers with the weight of a man who had seen enough winters to choose his words carefully. "Away from them," he said simply, before mounting behind her. His arms came around her, not in possession, but as a shield against the cold, his coat wrapping over both their bodies. The mare moved forward, her breath steaming in the frosty air. The ride was silent except for the rhythm of hooves breaking through crusted snow. But Elara's mind was far from still. No man had ever dared defy her uncle in public, and certainly no Comanche had strode into town and taken a white woman without facing a gun barrel for it. Yet here she was, heart pounding in the cage of his arms, the cold air biting at her cheeks while something far warmer stirred beneath her ribs. She didn't know if he meant to deliver her to another man, or if this was his claim, but there was no cruelty in his hold, only an unspoken promise that she wasn't going back. When they reached the ridge, she saw the outline of a low log cabin tucked against a stand of pines, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. He dismounted, then reached up and lifted her down with a gentleness that startled her more than the ride itself. "Inside," he said, voice deep as winter earth, "before you freeze." She hesitated at the threshold, snow clinging to her boots, unsure if stepping inside was a surrender or the first choice she'd made freely in years. The heat from the cabin's small stone hearth hit her like a wave, chasing away the numbness in her fingers and toes. Elara stood just inside the doorway, watching as the Comanche man moved with quiet purpose, shrugging off his heavy coat and setting a black rifle against the wall. His movements were economical, deliberate, as if every action was chosen for a reason. She wanted to demand answers, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. He walked past her without a glance and knelt by the fire, feeding it a thick log before turning to hang a kettle over the flames. Only then did he meet her eyes again. "Sit," he said simply, pointing to the bearskin rug in front of the hearth. His voice carried no threat, yet it left no room for refusal. She sat, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, the snow melting into small puddles around her boots. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice rough from the cold and the hours of silence. "Why did you take me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured steaming water into a tin cup, dropped in a pinch of dried leaves, and handed it to her. The fragrant steam curled into her face, and she realized it was tea, strong and earthy. "Because," he said at last, "I saw what they were going to do." His gaze flicked over her, not in hunger, but in quiet assessment. "And I don't let wolves eat the wounded." She flinched, the words cutting deeper than she expected. He leaned back on his heels, resting one forearm on his knee. "Your uncle?" She nodded stiffly, shame crawling up her neck. "Said I was too wild. Said no man would have me." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like steel catching light. "They say that when they fear the fire," he murmured. She didn't know if he meant her spirit or her defiance. For a long moment, the only sound was the snap of the firewood. Then he rose and crossed to a small cupboard, pulling out a folded quilt. He draped it around her shoulders without a word. She stared up at him, feeling the strange safety of his presence pressing against every fear she'd carried. "You're safe here," he said quietly, and for some reason she believed him. But as she sipped the tea and watched the snow swirl outside the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he'd saved her from in town might still be coming. The wind howled outside, battering the cabin walls like fists against a drum. Elara sat wrapped in the quilt, watching the Comanche man, Tahoe, she'd heard one of the townsmen call him, methodically check the lock on the door, then slide a heavy wooden bar into place. His movements were unhurried, but there was a tension in his shoulders that told her he was listening to something she couldn't yet hear. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't answer at first, stepping to the window and peering through a small gap in the curtain. The firelight threw his shadow across the wall, tall and unshakable. "They'll come," he said finally. "Men like that don't let go easy, not when they think something's theirs." Her stomach tightened. She thought of her uncle's sneer, the jeers of the men in the saloon, and the sharp laughter that had followed her out into the snow before Tahoe lifted her without a word. She didn't want to imagine what would have happened if he hadn't. "What will you do?" she asked, his mouth curved in something between a smile and a grim line. "Whatever I must." He moved to the hearth and pulled on his coat again, this time fastening a leather strap across his chest where a hunting knife rested in a sheath. Then he crouched down in front of her. "If anyone tries to open that door, You take the rifle from the wall. Aim for the middle." Her hands tightened around the quilt. "I've never fired a gun." "Then you learn tonight," he said, rising. "I'll be just outside." She wanted to protest, to tell him not to go into the storm, but something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't recklessness she saw there, but a steady resolve. He slipped out into the snow, the door closing with a solid thud behind him. The moment he was gone, the wind seemed louder, and the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to grow. She forced herself to stand, crossing to the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, the cold metal biting into her fingers. She kept it close, every creak of the cabin making her pulse leap. Minutes felt like hours until she heard it, boots crunching in the snow, too many for one man. Her breath caught. Then came the voices, low and slurred, the words lost in the wind, but the tone unmistakable. They were here. She gripped the rifle tighter, her heart pounding, knowing Tahoe had been right. They hadn't come to talk. The first pounding on the door shook the entire frame, jolting Elara from the bench where she sat, gripping the rifle. The voices outside were clearer now, dripping with the drunken bravado she had grown to dread. "Open up, wild girl. Time to finish what you started," one of them called, followed by the sound of laughter, harsh and jagged like breaking glass. She rose to her feet, her knees trembling, the quilt falling to the floor. Her fingers curled tighter around the rifle, the weight of it suddenly feeling like her only anchor. Through the storm's roar came another sound, a low, steady voice that cut through the chaos. Tahoe's. She couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unyielding, commanding. "Turn back." The laughter outside faltered, replaced by shouts of protest. Boots shifted in the snow. Then came another voice, one she recognized instantly, her uncle's, dripping with venom. "You don't own her, savage. She's ours by blood and by right." Elara's stomach clenched, her breath freezing in her lungs. There was a pause, an awful, stretching silence, and then the unmistakable scrape of steel being drawn from a sheath. The sound was answered almost instantly by the crash of movement, the scuffle of boots, and the muffled thud of fists meeting flesh. She darted to the small window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. The snowstorm blurred everything into shadows, but she could make out Tahoe's form, broad and unshaken, moving with a predator's precision. One man lunged toward him and was sent sprawling into the snow, clutching his ribs. Another came from the side, only to be met with the flat of Tahoe's knife hilt against his jaw, dropping him like a felled tree. But then she saw her uncle, circling closer with a pistol in his hand, the barrel glinting dully in the moonlight. Her breath caught. He was aiming at Tahoe's back. She didn't think. She moved. Throwing the door open, she stepped into the snow, the wind slapping her face and stealing her breath. The rifle felt impossibly heavy, but she raised it, just as her uncle's finger began to tighten on the trigger. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the storm. For a split second, every man froze. Her uncle turned, sneering at the sight of her in the doorway. "Put that down, girl. You wouldn't dare." Her heart pounded, her hands shook, but her eyes locked on Tahoe's, steady, calm, telling her everything she needed to know. She tightened her grip, feeling the decision settle deep in her bones. She was done running. Snow swirled between them, each flake catching the pale light before vanishing into the darkness. But Elara barely noticed. All she saw was her uncle's finger curling tighter on the trigger, the cold gleam in his eyes, and the man who had stood between her and the world's cruelty, standing unaware in the line of fire. Her heart thudded so hard it felt as if it might split her ribs. She didn't think. She acted. The rifle's report shattered the night like lightning tearing open the sky. Her shoulder jolted backward from the force, the echo ringing in her ears as a black shape crumpled into the snow. For a breathless moment, she thought she'd killed him. But then her uncle groaned, clutching his arm where blood seeped hot against the white. His pistol fell, vanishing in the drift. Tahoe spun at the sound, eyes locking on her with something unreadable. Pride, perhaps, or disbelief. The other men, wide-eyed and shaken, began stumbling backward, their courage bleeding out into the night along with the storm's fury. One cursed under his breath, another spat in the snow, but none of them dared step forward. They hauled her uncle to his feet, muttering about "not worth it" and "the girl's gone feral," before dragging him into the darkness. The silence afterward felt heavier than the fight itself, broken only by the slow crunch of Tahoe's boots approaching her. She lowered the rifle, hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. She began, but the words caught in her throat. He reached out, his massive hand curling gently over the barrel to take it from her, setting it aside in the snow. "You didn't miss," he said simply, his voice low and steady, as if speaking to calm a startled colt. The meaning in his tone hit her harder than the recoil had. He wasn't just talking about her aim. She had stood her ground. She had chosen to fight. Her breath came in shaky bursts, the cold finally seeping into her bones. But when he draped his fur-lined coat over her shoulders, she didn't flinch away. "They'll come back," she whispered, her eyes darting to the tree line. "Let them," he replied, a shadow of a smile ghosting over his lips. "They'll find more than the wild girl waiting." His gaze held hers for a moment too long, a quiet vow beneath the words. Together they turned toward the cabin, the snow already covering the footprints of those who had fled. Inside, the fire still burned, casting its light like a beacon against the dark. She realized, as she stepped back into its glow, that for the first time in years, the wild in her felt less like a curse and more like a strength. The cabin door shut behind them with a deep, satisfying thud, sealing out the howling wind. Elara stood there for a moment, her breath clouding in the dim light, listening to the quiet pop and crackle of the fire. The storm outside was wild, relentless, but in here the air felt heavy with something else, something that made her heartbeat skip. Tahoe moved past her without a word, setting the rifle against the wall before stoking the fire. His large frame blocked most of the glow, but when he turned, she saw the faintest trace of snow melting on his beard, glistening like silver. He didn't look at her the way most men did. There was no greed in his gaze, no judgment, only a steady measuring, as though he was trying to decide how much she could carry before she'd break. She lowered herself into the chair nearest the hearth, her muscles aching from the cold and the tension that had gripped her all night. "You should eat," he said, motioning toward a pot simmering on the stove. She didn't move. "You're not going to ask me why they call me too wild?" Her voice was soft, almost daring. He set down the iron poker, resting one forearm on the mantel. "I've seen wild," he replied. "You're not it." Something about the certainty in his tone sent a strange warmth through her, one that had nothing to do with the fire. For years, her so-called wildness had been the excuse men used to control or punish her. Yet here stood a man who didn't seem afraid of it, or interested in taming it. She tried to mask the sting in her eyes by leaning forward to stir the stew, but Tahoe noticed. He walked to the table, pulling out the chair across from hers, the wood groaning under his weight. "Tell me," he said, not as an order, but an invitation. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, she did. She spoke of the times she'd refused to marry the old men her uncle picked for her, of the nights she'd snuck out to ride bareback under the moon, of the moment she'd struck a man who grabbed her arm too hard. Every word spilled out like a confession, But instead of judgment, she saw a flicker of something close to admiration in Tahoe's eyes. "If that's wild," he said finally, his voice like a quiet drumbeat, "then I'll take wild over broken any day." Outside, the storm raged, but inside, something unspoken shifted between them. An understanding, fragile but undeniable. She didn't know if it was trust yet, but it was a beginning. And in this land, beginnings were rarer than warmth in winter. The wind slammed against the cabin walls like an angry beast, but Elara barely noticed. Tahoe had returned to the hearth, crouching low as he adjusted the logs, the fire casting a bronze halo around his broad shoulders. The smell of pine smoke and simmering stew wrapped around her, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. She ate slowly, watching him from across the table, each movement deliberate, each glance measured. He didn't fill the silence with questions or idle talk. Instead, he let it stretch, as if he understood that quiet could be more comforting than words. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "They'll come for me, you know." Tahoe didn't look up from tying the rawhide strap on his boots. "Let them try," he said, the words carrying a weight that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't understand," she pressed, her fingers tightening around the spoon. "Men like them, they don't forget, and they don't forgive." His gaze lifted to hers then, steady and unyielding. "Neither do I." Something in his tone, calm, certain, dangerous, unlocked a part of her she had fought to keep hidden. For so long she had been braced for attack, for cruelty disguised as kindness, that she'd forgotten what it was to have someone stand between her and the storm. The thought scared her almost as much as it soothed her. She pushed back her chair and crossed to the window, brushing aside the frost-lined curtain. Snow swirled thick in the darkness, the trees bending under the storm's fury. But there, just beyond the fence line, she saw a shadow move. "Tahoe." Her voice was sharp now, the word a warning. He was already on his feet, rifle in hand, his movements fluid and soundless. He stepped beside her, following her gaze into the white chaos outside. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, tall, wrapped in a long coat, unmoving despite the wind's bite. It was impossible to see his face, but Elara knew it wasn't just a lost traveler. Her stomach clenched. Without a word, Tahoe set the rifle by the door and reached for his heavy, fur-lined coat. "Stay inside," he told her, his voice quiet but edged with iron. She grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling. "Don't go out there. It's not safe." He looked down at her hand, then at her face, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the unshakable mountain man slipped, replaced by something warmer. "It's not safe for them," he said, and stepped out into the storm. Elara stood frozen in the doorway as the snow swallowed him, the shadow at the tree line waiting like a ghost from her past. She didn't know what was about to happen, but she knew it would change everything. The storm swallowed Tahoe within moments, his massive frame vanishing into the curtain of white. Elara pressed her palm to the doorframe, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. She strained to see through the snow, her breath clouding the glass. A flicker of movement, a dark silhouette shifting, told her Tahoe had reached the figure. The wind carried muffled voices, but the words were lost in the roar of the storm. Minutes dragged like hours. Elara's mind raced through every possibility. An outlaw from her old life, someone sent to drag her back in chains, or maybe one of the men from the Comanche's own battles past. When the two shapes suddenly lunged toward each other, her breath caught. The figures struggled briefly, then Tahoe shoved the stranger hard enough that he staggered back into the snow. She gripped the edge of the door, torn between fear and the urge to run to him. The stranger recovered quickly, and instead of retreating, he stepped closer, his hands lifted, not in surrender but holding something. Even through the blur of snow, she could see the glint of metal and leather. A rifle? A blade? The door flew open and Tahoe strode back inside, the storm clinging to his coat and hair like frost. In one hand, he held a snow-dusted knife. In the other, the stranger's wrist, bound tightly with rawhide. The man stumbled behind him, his face half hidden by a scarf, eyes sharp and full of hate. Elara stepped back as Tahoe shoved the man into the chair by the fire. "Friend of yours?" he asked, his tone heavy with something between mockery and warning. Her breath hitched when the scarf slipped down, revealing the man's face. The deep scar running from his temple to his jaw was as familiar as the nightmares it had haunted for years. "Redden," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man's lips curled into a slow, ugly grin. "Thought you could hide in the mountains, girl?" His gaze flicked to Tahoe. "This your new master?" Tahoe's hand tightened on the man's shoulder, and his voice dropped low, dangerous. "I don't own her, and you won't either." The fire popped, sending shadows leaping across the walls. Elara could feel the storm's rage outside, but in here the air was tighter, heavier, as though the cabin itself knew blood was about to be spilled. Redden's smirk didn't falter. "You'll regret crossing me, Comanche." Tahoe's eyes didn't blink. "Not tonight." He reached for the rifle propped by the door, his movements deliberate. Elara's pulse thundered in her ears. Whatever was about to happen, she knew it would decide whether she ever truly escaped her past, or died trying. The storm raged outside, but it was nothing compared to the silent war inside the cabin. Elara stood frozen, her hands trembling as Tahoe leveled the rifle at Redden's chest. The man didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and snake-like, flicked between them, calculating. "You won't shoot me," Redden drawled, his voice slow and taunting. "Not with her watching. You're trying to be the hero, aren't you, Comanche?" Tahoe didn't move, but his voice was steady as stone. "The difference between me and the men you've known is that I don't need to prove anything. But if you threaten her again, there won't be a second warning." Redden laughed, a dry, rasping sound that grated against Elara's nerves. "She belongs to me. She's been mine since you beat me half to death and left me in the dirt," Elara cut in sharply, her voice rising for the first time since he'd entered. The fear that had gripped her for years seemed to crack, replaced by something hotter. Her hands clenched into fists. "You think I'm still that girl you could chain and command? Look at me, Redden. I'm not yours. I'll never be yours again." For a brief moment, his smirk faltered. Then he lunged, his chair toppling backward with a crash. Elara screamed, but Tahoe moved faster than the wind outside, slamming the butt of the rifle into Redden's chest and sending him sprawling onto the floorboards. The room erupted into chaos. The two men grappled, their boots thudding against the wood, the fire throwing wild shadows over their struggle. Tahoe's strength was brutal and efficient, every movement fueled by a quiet, controlled rage. Redden's knife clattered across the floor, spinning to a stop at Elara's feet. She stared at it for a heartbeat before snatching it up, her knuckles white around the hilt. "End it, Tahoe," she whispered. Tahoe pinned Redden with one knee, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. But then his eyes flicked to Elara, not to ask permission but to remind her that the choice was hers. Slowly she stepped forward, the knife trembling in her hand. She crouched beside Redden, so close she could see the fear creeping into his gaze. "You came here thinking you'd take me back," she said, her voice low and steady. "Instead, you're going to crawl out into that storm and pray it swallows you before I change my mind." Tahoe rose, hauling Redden to his feet and shoving him towards the door. Without another word, he kicked it open, the blizzard roaring in to greet them. Redden stumbled into the white void and vanished. Tahoe shut the door, the cabin falling into a deep, warm silence. Elara's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor. Tahoe knelt beside her, his hand brushing snow from her cheek. "You're safe now," he murmured. For the first time in years, she believed it.